The autumn wind cut through the empty streets of Shadyside like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and something else. Something that made people lock their doors early and pull their curtains tight against the gathering darkness. It had been 3 weeks since the first body was found, sprawled across the rusted carousel in the abandoned fairgrounds on the edge of town, and the terror that had taken root in the hearts of Fear Street's residents had grown into something almost alive, a presence that seemed to pulse through the neighborhood with every setting sun. The victim had been a teenager, just 17, found with her eyes wide open and a look of pure horror frozen on her face, her body positioned as if she were still riding the peeling horse, one hand raised in the air as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The police said she'd been missing for 2 days before they found her, and the coroner's report mentioned things that the local newspaper refused to print. Details that leaked out anyway through whispered conversations at the grocery store and frightened texts between friends who no longer went anywhere alone. What made it worse, what made it the kind of thing that parents couldn't explain away or rationalize, was what the killer left behind. At first, people thought it was some kind of sick joke, the sort of prank that teenagers might pull around Halloween. But when the second body appeared 5 days later, dangling from the old oak tree in the cemetery like a grotesque ornament, everyone knew it was something far more sinister. The calling card was always the same, a single balloon, bright red and perfectly inflated, tied to the victim's wrist with a white ribbon, and beside each body, drawn in what forensics confirmed was the victim's own blood, a crude smiling face, the kind a child might draw, simple and round with exaggerated features that seemed to mock the horror of the scene. The third victim was found in the high school parking lot, stuffed into the trunk of his own car, discovered only when his worried mother called the police after he didn't come home from his late shift at the gas station. He was 22, had graduated 2 years earlier, and everyone said he was a good kid who kept himself and worked hard to save money for a community college. The balloon was there again, bobbing gently in the morning breeze when the police opened the trunk, and the painted smile on the car's rear window was visible from 50 feet away, greeting the horrified officers with its cheerful malevolence. The town meeting at Shadyside High's auditorium drew almost every resident who could fit through the doors, faces pale and drawn with sleepless nights and the constant gnawing anxiety that had become as familiar as breathing. The police chief stood at the podium, a heavy-set man in his 50s whose usual confidence had been replaced by someone that looked dangerously close to defeat, and he tried to reassure the crowd that they were doing everything possible, that state investigators had been called in, that there were patrols running through the night. But his words fell hollow against the weight of fear that pressed down on everyone in that room. Someone from the back shouted that their kids were too scared to sleep, that people were leaving town, that Fear Street was dying from the inside out, and the chief could only nod grimly and promise to catch whoever was responsible before anyone else got hurt. But promises meant nothing when the sun went down, and the streets transformed into something unrecognizable, a place where every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and every sound made hearts race, and hands reach for phones or weapons or anything that might offer some small measure of protection. The killer seemed to know the town intimately, seemed to understand exactly which houses sat just far enough from their neighbors that a scream might not be heard, which alleys offered perfect cover, which routes teenagers took when they walked home from evening shifts or late study sessions. The attacks followed no pattern that investigators could discern, no connection between victims beyond their age, and the fact that they were all caught alone after dark, and that randomness made it somehow worse because it meant anyone could be next. The balloon shop on Center Street, a cheerful little place that had been run by the same family for 3 generations, closed its doors permanently after someone threw a brick through the window with a note telling them they were helping a murderer. The owner, an elderly woman who had sold balloons at every birthday party and celebration in Shadyside for 40 years, left town within a week, her shop boarded up and covered in graffiti that accused her of crimes she would never have imagined in her worst nightmares. The hardware store sold out of locks and security cameras, and suddenly every porch light in the neighborhood burned bright through the night, a constellation of desperate hope that illumination might somehow keep the darkness at bay. Then came the sightings, and with them a new dimension of terror that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. A woman walking her dog at dusk swore she saw a figure standing beneath the streetlight at the corner of Fear Street and Canyon Road, perfectly still, wearing what looked like a costume covered in bright patches of color, with a white face that reflected the light like a mirror and a smile painted on in black that stretched far too wide to be natural. She called the police immediately, but by the time a patrol car arrived 3 minutes later, there was nothing there except the faint smell of grease paint and candy, and a single red balloon caught in the branches of a nearby tree, swaying back and forth as if waved by an invisible hand. More reports followed, each one adding details that built a picture so disturbing that many people refused to believe it could be real, convinced instead that mass hysteria had taken hold, that fear had manifested something that didn't truly exist. But the bodies continued to appear, and with each one the descriptions became more consistent, more impossible to dismiss as imagination or panic. The figure was tall, moved with an unnatural fluidity that several witnesses described as not quite human, and the costume it wore was a riot of colors that seemed too bright, too vivid, as if they had been painted by someone who had never actually seen real circus performers and had instead drawn from some fevered dream of what such a thing might look like. The face was what haunted people most in their nightmares, a white oval of makeup or mask that transformed human features into something alien and wrong, with eyes that some said were completely black, while others swore reflected light like an animal's. And that smile, always that smile, stretched across the lower half of the face in a crimson slash that seemed to promise terrible things behind its cheerful facade. One teenage boy who claimed to have seen the figure up close, standing outside his bedroom window on the second floor of his house, said the smile never moved, never changed, even as the figure tilted its head and seemed to study him with intelligence that was worse than mere animal cunning, something that suggested calculation and dark amusement at his terror. The high school became a fortress during the day and a ghost town after the final bell, with administrators canceling all evening activities, including sports practices and drama rehearsals, and parents forming carpool networks to ensure no teenager ever walked anywhere alone. The Friday night football games that had been a Shadyside tradition for decades were postponed indefinitely, and the autumn festival that should have been filling the town square with music and laughter and the smell of caramel apples was quietly canceled, its decorations packed away and used because no one could imagine celebrating while a killer stalked their streets. In the houses along Fear Street itself, where the old trees grew thick and the Victorian homes sat close together like gossiping neighbors, the atmosphere was suffocating. Families that had lived there for generations talk about selling and moving away, about starting over somewhere that didn't feel cursed, because that was a word that kept coming up in conversations, cursed, as if this was somehow the inevitable result of building a neighborhood on land that had never wanted to be settled. The local historian, a retired professor who had written 3 books about Shadyside's dark past, gave an interview to a true crime podcast where she detailed a long history of tragedy that plagued the area, murders and disappearances, and accidents that stretched back over 200 years. And while she stopped short of saying the town was genuinely haunted or evil, her careful academic language couldn't quite hide her own unease. The 4th victim was a girl of 19 who worked at the public library, found in the stacks after closing time by the security guard making his rounds, her body arranged between the shelves as if she were browsing for a book, and the red balloon tied to the shelf above her head, so it floated at exactly eye level. The library closed immediately, and rumors spread that the killer had left something else this time, a note written in that same childish hand, though the police refused to confirm what it said, or even if it existed. Whatever the truth, the discovery seemed to break something in the town's collective spirit, and the next morning saw a stream of moving trucks heading out of Shadyside as families who had weathered every previous crisis finally admitted defeat. Those who remained began to change in subtle ways that reflected their new reality. Teenagers who had once snuck out to meet friends or attend parties now begged their parents to let them sleep with the lights on, and adults who had prided themselves on their independence started checking in with neighbors multiple times a day, creating informal networks of safety calls and text chains that pinged constantly with updates. The local churches saw attendance surge as people sought comfort or answers or simply a place to be surrounded by other human beings, and the prayer services that had once been quiet, contemplative affairs turned into emotional outpourings of fear and grief and desperate pleas for divine intervention. The police brought in a criminal profiler from the State Bureau of Investigation, a woman with decades of experience tracking serial killers, and she spent a week interviewing witnesses and studying crime scenes before giving a press conference that offered little comfort. The killer was organized and intelligent, she explained, someone who planned meticulously and derived satisfaction not just from the act of murder itself, but from the terror it inspired in the community. The clown imagery was deliberate, chosen specifically because it subverted something associated with childhood joy and transformed it into a source of primal fear, and the balloons served as both signature and taunt, a way of marking territory and asserting dominance over the psychological landscape of the town. What she didn't say, but what everyone understood, was that this kind of killer rarely stopped on her own, that the escalation visible in the increasing frequency of attacks and the boldness of the crime scenes suggested someone working toward some ultimate goal that existed only in their own twisted logic. The profile suggested the killer likely lived in or near Shadyside, was probably male though not certainly so, and had a deep familiarity with the area's geography and rhythms. But those details were so broad as to be almost useless in a town where nearly everyone fit at least some part of the description. Vigilante groups formed despite police warnings. Clusters of men and a few women who armed themselves and patrolled the streets in shifts, their presence offering some residents a sense of security, while making others nervous about what might happen if these amateur hunters actually encountered the killer or worse, mistook an innocent person for their target. There were close calls, moments of tension when someone in a jacket with bright patches was confronted aggressively only to turn out to be a delivery driver or a college student with unfortunate fashion sense. And the police chief had to hold another press conference urging people to leave law enforcement to professionals, while simultaneously admitting that professional efforts had so far proven completely ineffective. The local news picked up the story, then regional outlets, and finally national media descended on Shadyside like vultures on carrion, their satellite trucks lining the streets, and their reporters doing stand-ups in front of crime scene tape, while residents tried to go about their daily lives under the glare of cameras and the weight of a scrutiny that felt invasive and exploitative. The coverage brought its own problems. Copycat threats called into schools and businesses, online sleuths who dox random residents based on nothing but speculation and circumstantial details, an inevitable flood of tourists and true crime enthusiasts who treated the town's tragedy as entertainment, showing up to take photographs and visit the locations where bodies have been found as if they were on some kind of macabre vacation. Halloween was 2 weeks away, and the debate about whether to cancel trick-or-treating tore the community apart in ways that surprised everyone with their intensity. Some parents argued that giving in to fear was exactly what the killer wanted, that allowing their children's lives to be completely disrupted was a form of surrender, while others thought the very idea of sending kids out into the dark in costumes was beyond reckless, a form of tempting fate that no responsible adult could support. The compromise, such as it was, involved organized events at the high school gymnasium and the community center, contained celebrations where children could dress up and collect candy in environments that could be secured and monitored. But even these plans felt sad and diminished, a pale shadow of what Halloween was supposed to be. Then came the night that changed everything, when a group of 4 teenagers decided they were tired of being afraid, tired of having their lives controlled by some psychopath in makeup, and made a plan to prove they weren't victims waiting to be chosen. They were all seniors, all athletes, all convinced of their own invincibility in a way that only 17-year-olds can be, and they armed themselves with baseball bats and pepper spray, and set out to walk the most dangerous parts of Fear Street after midnight, daring the killer to try something while they were ready and waiting. They live-streamed the whole thing on social media, their phones held up to show the empty streets and their own nervous laughter, their bravado coming through in commentary that mixed genuine fear with performative toughness, and hundreds of people watched from the safety of their homes as the 4 figures moved through pools of streetlight and shadow, their breath visible in the cold October air. For an hour nothing happened, and the viewers began to relax, some even mocking the teenagers for their dramatics, suggesting the whole thing was staged or that the killer had probably moved on to easier targets. Then one of the phones caught something in the background, just for a moment, a flash of color behind a parked car, and the comment section exploded with warnings and frantic messages telling them to run, to get out of there, but the teenagers didn't see the alerts fast enough. The next few minutes of footage were chaos, screaming and running, and the phone cameras catching wild spinning views of pavement and sky and a face, that terrible painted face, moving with impossible speed toward the camera before the feed cut out abruptly, all 4 streams going dark within seconds of each other. The police found 3 of them 20 minutes later, huddled together in someone's backyard, hysterical and bruised but alive, babbling about how fast it had moved, how it had come out of nowhere, how the face had been right there, so close they could smell the makeup and something else, something rotten and sweet like flowers left too long in a vase. The 4th teenager, A boy named Marcus, who had been the leader of the group, was missing, and the massive search that launched immediately involved every available officer, the state police, volunteers with flashlights and dogs, all of them combing through the neighborhood while the sun rose on another day of horror. They found him at dawn, alive but catatonic, sitting in the old gazebo at Fear Street Park with a red balloon tied to his wrist and his face painted with that same crude smile, the makeup applied roughly over his own features, so that he looked like a terrible mockery of the killer, a living message. He didn't speak for 3 days, and when he finally did, his words were so fragmented and disturbing that the hospital kept him under psychiatric observation. But the pieces that leaked out painted a picture of hours spent with Killer, being told things and shown things that had broken something fundamental in his understanding of reality. The attack on the teenagers galvanized the remaining residents in a way that previous murders hadn't, perhaps because these victims had fought back, had tried to be heroes, and the killer's response had been to turn one of them into a living trophy. The vigils and prayer services gave way to town halls, where serious discussions happened about evacuation, about whether Shadyside as a community could survive this, or if it was time to admit defeat and disband. Let the old houses stand empty, and let Fear Street return to the wilderness that had existed before anyone tried to build something permanent there. Believing meant giving up homes and history and roots that went back generations, meant admitting that evil could win simply by being persistent enough. And something in that idea sparked resistance in people who had been ready to flee. A core group of residents, maybe 200 people out of thousands who had once called Shadyside home, decided to stay and fight, though what fighting meant in practical terms was unclear. They organized more patrols, installed more cameras, created safe houses where people could gather after dark, and reached out to experts, former FBI agents and retired detectives, and even a paranormal investigator who showed up with equipment that beeped and flashed and recorded electromagnetic fields, though what use any of that might be against a very human killer was anyone's guess. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a young woman who worked at the county records office and who had become obsessed with the case, spending her lunch breaks and evenings poring over old files and documents, looking for patterns or connections that police might have missed. She found property records for the old fairgrounds where the first body was discovered, traced ownership back through shell corporations and defunct holding companies, and eventually uncovered a name that appeared nowhere in police reports but had been associated with Shadyside decades earlier, a performer who had worked in traveling circuses and carnivals, someone with a history of complaints and accusations that had never quite resulted in charges but painted a picture of someone dangerous and obsessed with the imagery and trappings of his former profession. The record showed he had purchased property on the outskirts of town 15 years ago, a plot of land that included an old farmhouse, and though there was no current address listed and no indication he still lived there, it was the first real lead anyone had developed. The police organized a raid, bringing in SWAT teams and negotiators and every resource they could muster, and they hit the property at dawn, expecting resistance or booby traps or confrontation that would end in violence. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined, a house that had been transformed into a shrine to murder and performance art, rooms filled with costumes and makeup and photographs of victims, not just the recent ones, but others stretching back years, maybe decades, faces of people no one had connected to current case, but who now represented a body count that was staggering in its scope. The basement had been set up like a stage, complete with lighting and props, and the evidence suggested the killer had been filming the murders, creating some kind of twisted documentary of his work, though the recordings themselves were never found, presumably destroyed or hidden in a location that remained secret. But the killer wasn't there, and the evidence suggested he hadn't been for at least a week, as if he had somehow known the police were closing in and had abandoned the location before they could arrive. The discovery was simultaneously a victory and a devastating defeat, confirmation that everything people had feared was true and more, but without the closure of actually stopping the person responsible. The search expanded to every property associated with the name, every known associate, every possible hiding place. But days turned into weeks with no sign of the killer. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No new bodies, no sightings, no balloons left floating in the dawn light, and people didn't know if that meant the killer had moved on to some other town, or if he was simply waiting, biding his time until attention shifted and vigilance relaxed. The Halloween that had seemed so fraught with danger came and went, a subdued affair where a few brave families ventured out for the organized events while most stayed home, doors locked and lights on, listening to the silence of empty streets that should have been filled with laughter and excitement. Slowly, carefully, life began to return to something approaching normal, though the normal was forever altered by what had happened, a new baseline of fear and awareness that would never completely fade. Some of the families who had left returned, unable to afford starting over elsewhere or unwilling to abandon homes that represented their entire lives, and they worked to repair what had been broken, both the physical damage to buildings and property and the less tangible harm done to the community's sense of itself. The investigation remained open, the case files growing thicker with each passing month as detectives followed leads that went nowhere and chased shadows that dissolved under scrutiny, and the killer's face, that painted smile and those dead eyes, became another piece of Shadyside's dark history. Another ghost story told to frightened children and curious outsiders who wanted to know what had happened during those terrible weeks when Fear Street earned its name in ways no one could have. Imagine the red balloons that sometimes appeared caught in trees or drifting through parking lots were treated with a superstitious dread, as if they might be messages or warnings or signs that the nightmare wasn't truly over, and people wondered if they would ever feel safe again or that security had been an illusion all along, a comfortable lie that had been stripped away to reveal the darkness that lurked just beyond the streetlights, waiting for its moment to emerge and remind everyone that some hunts never really end. They just pause between kills.